Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to Officers for the Climate Change Authority, and particularly welcome to the Honourable Mr Matt Keane, the Chair. Would you care to make an opening statement?
No, fine to get straight into it.
No? Okay.
Chair.
Excellent. Look, I saw your media release this morning. Has everybody seen? I might table that just so everyone's got it. Do you want to just give us a bit of an outline of what you put out this morning and tell us what it was that you found about emissions implications of waiting for nuclear by extending coal-fired power generation in the independent research that you undertook?
Well, thank you, Chair, and thank you for allowing me to appear before the committee today. I guess there's a couple of takeouts from the body of work that the Climate Change Authority did, looking at the emissions impacts of AEMO's step change pathway, which is effectively the pathway that the government is on, and the alternate government's proposal under the frontier economics modelling. The work that was done by the Climate Change Authority, our science branch and our analytical branch, very clearly shows that Australia faces a fork in the road when it comes to emissions being emitted into the economy. Under the proposed pathway that Frontier Economics have talked about, so let's call it a nuclear pathway, the Climate Change Authority sees that it would lead to an additional 1 billion tonnes of carbon emissions going into the atmosphere from the electricity and energy sector alone. Now remember, Senator, that's only 35% of the total emissions profile of the Australian economy. You need to decarbonise the electricity and energy sector before you can start decarbonising other sectors of the economy. And under that progressive scenario that the Frontier Economics team have modelled, it would potentially lead to an additional 1 billion tonnes of carbon emissions from other sections of the economy. So under the progressive scenario modelled by Frontier, looked at by the Climate Change Authority, it could lead to an additional 2 billion tonnes of carbon emissions going into the atmosphere under the nuclear scenario that's been put forward. Now, the alternate scenario means that you replace your ageing and less reliable coal-fired power stations sooner with cleaner forms of generation that also happen to be cheaper and more reliable, and it also sets you up to help decarbonise other sections of the economy. The thing about the 2 billion tonne nuclear carbon emission bomb that would be dropped on the economy as a result of the Frontier Economics pathway is that that would put the world, that would be consistent with the world being on a 2.6 degree warming trajectory. Australia has signed up to the Paris agreements. That's been a bipartisan position of the coalition and also the Labor government. That commits governments to do their very best to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, or do their very best to keep it below 1.5 degrees. Now, there's a lot that needs to go right to ensure that happens, but one thing that I can assure the committee is that you've got no chance of meeting that if you go down the nuclear scenario as proposed under the Frontier Economics modelling.
And so the implication there is that you would extend the existing coal generation that we have at the moment?
Well, that's in the Frontier Economics modelling. We can only work on the data that's been put before us, and that suggests that you will extend ageing and less reliable coal-fired power stations for longer. That will see an additional 1 billion tonnes of carbon emissions being emitted into the atmosphere, as well as increasing bills for consumers, as well as taking a long time to deliver into the system. So there's a very clear fork in the road for Australia when it comes to emissions. Under the existing policy settings, you'll see 2 billion tonnes of emissions less than under the pathway proposed under Frontier Economics modelling.
So you conclude by saying that staying the course by continuing to roll out a mix of renewable generation, storage and firming at pace is the only option.
Well, that's the technology available to us to roll out at scale today, and that's what the independent experts at AEMO advise is the best pathway to decarbonise the electricity system at lowest cost to consumers and taxpayers. So we'll follow the advice of the engineers and the economists and the experts. Energy policy should be all about economics and engineering, not ideology, and that's the path that Australia is currently on. What I will say, Chair, is that under the existing scenario, pointed out, it gives Australia its best chance of reaching net zero by 2050. Now, that's something that all sides of politics, or the three major parties have signed up for. Under the modelling, as a result of the modelling undertaken by the Climate Change Authority, it would make it virtually impossible, or very, very close to impossible, for net zero by 2050 to be achieved under the nuclear pathway. So I wanted that to be very clear. Under the Coalition's proposed pathway put forward by Frontier Economics, it would make it almost impossible for Australia to hit net zero emissions by 2050.
So in addition to the not hitting net zero, I'm really concerned with this 2.6 degree scenario that you're talking about here. So obviously the Paris Agreement is 1.5, and that a significant number of countries have signed up to that, and it's been what we've been aiming for some time. And you're saying that this alternative pathway is 2.6 degrees. What sort of implication does that have?
Well, consistent with 2.6 degrees. I mean, the implications of that are very clear. The scientists, the economists, governments around the world have told us that that will have catastrophic impacts on our environment, and modelling that we've also seen suggests that there would be a 10% reduction in GDP if you were to go down that path. I'll let the CEO talk to those figures in greater detail, but there are huge implications for us not meeting those targets. I'm not saying it's going to be easy to hit to keep things below 1.5 degrees. In fact, it's going to be difficult. However, what we do know is that plans to slow down the rate of decarbonisation of the global economy put us on a trajectory which could have devastating impacts for the environment and also the global economy.
10% in the economy, that's terrible. Mr Archer, would you like to expand for us?
Certainly, Chair, although I think Mr Keane has covered that pretty nicely. Clearly, the Paris Agreement commitments that countries have made is to limit global warming to below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. I think the Climate Change Authority has been on the record for many years now that it is in Australia's interests to be acting as a leader in responding to climate change, and that it would also be in Australia's interest to do so, both not just for global environmental outcomes but also for economic outcomes as well, as globally there is a transition to a net zero economy. So I think that's been a consistent message from the Climate Change Authority, and I think examining the Frontier modelling report, we felt it was important to further examine the emissions implications of that. There was some information in that report, not a lot, hence the report that we've prepared and released.
Thank you. And the motivation for doing this report?
Can I take that,
Yes,
Senator?
most certainly.
So the Climate Change Authority, under its remit, is responsible for providing frank and fearless advice on policies that impact on climate change. Clearly, this is a policy that will have a big impact on our ability to meet our climate commitments and limit the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. So just as has been past practice by the Climate Change Authority to comment on policies by the government and also the alternate government, so too will we consider policies at this stage that could have an impact on our ability to meet our legislative commitments. We are here to act in the national interest. We are here to act for the environment and for taking action on climate change without fear or favour. That's exactly what we've done here. We've provided frank and fearless advice about the impacts of a major policy position by the alternative government.
Thank you.
And I should point out, this is something that the Climate Change Authority has, as Mr Keane has said, determined to do within the scope of its independent charter. The response of the alternative government to that, the response came 10 minutes ago when Senator Hume was on the ABC saying they would sack Mr Keane if they assumed government. Like, so sensitive to criticism, to independent criticism of their costly, dodgy, risky nuclear plan, catastrophic for Australian industry, catastrophic for households. All of the problems of imposing nuclear reactors on communities where no geotechnical work has been done, like in Muswellbrook, we've just seen 2 earthquakes over the course of the last 12 months. This outfit, the alternative government's response to independent criticism, is to bully people. Like that's the alternative. Bully people and sack people they don't like.
Order.
That's not, that is un-Australian, and it shows a complete lack of respect for independent organisations.
So, Minister, can I ask you? You say that Senator Hume stood up 10 minutes ago and said that due to this report, if she was to be in charge, she would sack Mr. Keane. On what basis?
She said, I was in the interview with her, she said I would see it hard to move forward with him after CCA has become so politicised. When she was asked about, when she was asked in an interview that is forthcoming on the ABC, I should say, due in a few minutes, that was the response of the Alternative Party of government. They don't like criticism. They're very sensitive to it. Mr. Morrison and Mr. Dutton very sensitive to it. In government, they don't like independent criticism. Rather than have an intelligent debate, they want to thump people they oppose.
That's alarming. Senator Cadell.
Well, I notice it's coming from the person that's already called people bones, heads and sleazy today. This is coming from there, but I'll move on. Earlier today, we had a conversation about the timing of the 2035.
It was they were separate.
No, it was
separate comments.
Yeah.
No. I accept that I said that. I'm just saying that it was not sleazy boneheads. It was a separate set of arguments.
Different people, much better.
I don't want to be misrepresented.
It's the current government, everyone.
And there was comments around the website originally saying February 25 for the 2035 target, changing now to 2025. Yes. The advice was they're waiting on advice or recommendations from you and your committee. What is the process of getting that to government? I know from I assume from an article you said about the USA and Trump and their policies. So can you go through the thought processes on that?
Well, I don't need to tell you, Senator, that the world's changed dramatically when it comes to climate policy and a whole range of other areas of public policy since the election of Donald Trump. I mean, just ask Volodymyr Zelensky about how much the world has changed. And when it comes to climate policy, obviously, Donald Trump has talked about removing the Inflation Reduction Act, for example. He's talked about, I think he has withdrawn, formally submitted his intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. He's talked about trade tariffs. All of these things will have an impact on the technologies that Australia is relying on to decarbonise its economy. So it's fit and proper that the body charged with providing independent, fact-based advice to the people of Australia and to the Parliament of Australia does the work necessary to understand the implications of those dramatic policy changes and the changes in the geopolitical environment. We're doing that work at the moment. We're doing that thorough analysis to understand what the impacts of Donald Trump's election are, what the responses are from other jurisdictions is, and how it will impact Australia. When I stand up and give advice to you and to the government of the day, I need to make sure that it's in the national interest, and that's why we're doing the work necessary to ensure that's the case. And Senator, can I just also draw your attention to the fact that Australia is not alone in taking this course of action when looking at its 2035 NDC. 179 out of 190 countries that have signed up to the Paris Agreement have also decided to delay when they announce their commitment. I went to COP. I met with over 20 of those delegations to understand what they're thinking of. It was the week after Donald Trump was elected, and they all told me the same thing. The playing field has moved. We need to consider things that are in the national interest when it comes to our emissions reduction pathways. That's what the Climate Change Authority has been charged with responsibility to do. That's exactly what we'll do, Senator.
On that, do you have a ballpark of how long you will need to do to assess all of those, given there's a new executive order every day or something?
Yeah.
Things can change day by day. Do you have an estimate when you might be confident to say? We heard September's a deadline. That's what we heard today.
Senator, it is dynamic. We're currently doing the work that's required, looking at these policies. As you said, it's hard to keep up with changes in executive orders just from Trump, let alone the responses from other jurisdictions. We've seen already China making some statements around things that will impact their supply chains. We need to understand that. We're deeply engaged in this process. We've committed a lot of resources within the authority to make sure that we do that work so that we can stand it up and give you and the senators and the people of Australia confidence that when we put forward a number, it's not only in our environment's interests, it's in our economy's interests.
Have you or Mr Archer given a desired time that you'd like to have a response by?
As soon as possible. As soon as possible.
What does that mean?
It means as soon as possible, Senator.
Yeah, but do you have a projected time frame? Or
It means when the work's done, Senator.
And how long do you think it will take?
As soon as possible.
So
we are doing the work.
People of
Things are
Australia
evolving.
Confidence is just an open-ended as soon as possible.
Well, Senator, we're doing a comprehensive body of work looking at the changing policy and political environment. Once that work is done, we'll then consider it in light of the modelling that we're working with the CSIRO on, and then we'll provide advice that I can say is in the national interest. That's what you'd expect me to do, I'd hope, Senator.
But a different way of saying, are we 50% through the work? Are we 90%? Are we 20% through the modelling you think you'd expect to do?
Well, I wouldn't want to speculate, Senator. What I want to do is make sure that we're doing the work necessary. Things are moving pretty quickly. Trump is putting out executive orders on a daily basis that are impacting our pathways to reduce our emissions. Again, we want to make sure the work we do is robust and that we can stand it up and say that it's in the national interest.
So can I just ask a question on this? The executive orders that are coming out at a frenetic pace, I would agree, from the United States. Can I just have a bit of an understanding of how they're impacting on the inputs to your analysis?
Well, take, for example, 45Q, which is a tax credit with regard to carbon sequestration. I would have thought that members of the National Party would be very interested in that tax credit. If that's abolished, then a number of the pathways to do carbon capture, the technologies that benefit from that can be scaled, that Australia could potentially benefit from, may not be available in the timeframe that we were previously considering, Senator.
Has that been abolished?
There is current discussion about a number of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act that could impact on Australia's pathways to reduce our emissions. That's just one such example where there are question marks around what the policy frameworks are going to be. But we can go into other sections, for example. We know that President Trump has talked about the impact of wind. Whether or not the supply chains for wind technologies will change as a result of the decisions that they're taking is something that we need to consider. Will it speed up our ability to roll out new technologies, or will it slow it down? We need to do this work. Things are fluid at the moment. We're currently considering that as we do our analysis.
And just on this 45Q tax credit, which is apparently of interest to the Nationals, how do you deal with that? If it hasn't yet been abolished, there are conversations ongoing and they could be going for 6, 12 months, who knows? I don't have an insight into what they're doing there. How do you factor that into your thinking if it is just a live question with no action taken?
I think we need to take reasonable guesses on some of these policies. So in that case, let me clarify that statement. I think we need to consider reasonable assumptions, Senator. The assumption on 45Q, for example, is that it has red state and blue state support, so it's probably likely to be more likely to stay. Whereas wind technology, for example, we know that that may have some question marks over it. So it's appropriate that we do that analysis. We're considering all the factors that could impact Australia's emissions reduction pathways so that we can have a robust number to give to you. And I would have thought, Senator, as the Shadow Environment Minister, you'd be very interested in the pathways that Australia could take to speed up its reduction of emissions.
And speeding up emissions reductions pathways and all sorts of things requires timely efforts on many of these things. Do these inputs to your analyses apply to all of the work you do, or just the targets, the 2035 targets?
Could you repeat the question?
So you've been talking about these considerations arising out of what the President of the United States is doing, for example, and that's having an impact on your capacity to deliver on a commitment that was made around the 2035 targets being announced. Does this set of uncertainties or considerations have an impact on all of the work you are doing, all of the analyses, all of the reports that this Authority is producing, or just the 2035 targets?
Well, we were talking specifically around the work of the NDC. I didn't realise you were broadening it out.
Oh, no, this is the second question. I'm entitled to broaden it out.
I'll speak specifically to the work we're doing on the NDC. Obviously, it's a changing political and geopolitical environment. We will consider that as we do the important work of advising the government of the day on what's in our national interest when it comes to reducing our emissions. I'd hope you'd expect that, Senator.
I expect a lot from this organisation, definitely, and we'll keep going with these questions. But just in terms of the report you were talking about before with Senator Grogan, you were able to finalise this. Were any of the considerations you've outlined with regard to the 2035 targets and, for example, the impacts arising out of the United States, which have delayed finalisation of your work there, been in any way factored into what you've been able to finalise with this comparison of policies?
Well, I'm glad you asked. I mean, obviously, the geopolitical environment that we're operating in to set an NDC is not something that just impacts Australia. That's affecting all countries that have signed up to the 2035, to the Paris agreements. As I said, 179 out of 190 countries, and I'll just check those fingers, is 195 countries, if we could correct the record, are taking more time to consider the impacts of that because things are changing very fast. What's not changing fast is the emissions impact of nuclear in the context of the Australian energy transition. Those figures can be well considered and well modelled, which is exactly what we've done. We've modelled the impacts of an emissions pathway in slowing down the step change scenario as proposed by AEMO, and we've seen an extra 2 billion tonnes of carbon emissions will be put into the atmosphere as a result of the pathway you're pursuing. Now, as the Shadow Environment Minister, I would have thought you'd be across that. I would have thought you'd have modelled it. Please tell me that in Shadow Cabinet you have spoken up and asked for an understanding of what the emissions impacts would be of various policies.
You mentioned in reference
allowed it through the Cabinet
that the after you referenced 45Q tax credit, you talked about changes to the availability of wind tech, and that therefore will have an impact on capacity to set 2035 targets. I wondered whether...
I was giving generic examples, Senator.
Yes, yeah, I know, but surely that is an input into comparing two energy policies. You've just talked about availability of the generation technology for one of those pathways, therefore being a problem when it comes to setting a 2035 target, but not in any other form of analysis?
Well, I think we've been very conservative in our analysis, actually, because if Donald Trump puts tariffs on wind supply chain technology, that could mean they're more available for places like Australia, speeding up our ability to deploy these at scale. So if anything, the Climate Change Authority has been conservative in its analysis, and the emissions profile comparison with the step change scenario that's set out compared to frontier economics is probably undercooked, to be honest.
We'll rotate the call and come back to you. Senator Van? No? Senator Billick.
Oh, thanks. Mr Keane, you mentioned earlier that Australia faces a fork in the road and we need to be clear about the choices in front of us. So are you able to tell me, based on your emissions outcomes, assuming that nuclear can come online within about 10 years, consistent with the frontier modelling, how much worse would the emissions outcomes be if nuclear was delayed in construction, as it has been in every other recent build?
Senator, we haven't modelled that. We've just modelled the inputs that have been used by frontier economics in their modelling. But I mean, there is no developed country anywhere in the world that has been able to deliver nuclear, large-scale nuclear, on time or on budget. So the idea that you would be able to deliver 7 large-scale nuclear reactors on the timeline set out in Frontier are ambitious at best. So the point being, the emissions profile that we've set out in our report today, an extra potentially 2 billion worth of emissions into the Australian economy. And let me be very clear, this is a 2 billion tonne nuclear carbon emission bomb that this would result in being dropped into the Australian atmosphere. We think that is conservative based on the reality and the lived experience of delivering nuclear right around the world at the moment. So we've put all the details in the report. We're here to give frank and fearless advice and provide independent expert advice about what's in the environment's interest. That's exactly what we've done here, and it's up to you now to determine what to do with that information.
Thanks. You look at the national implications on emissions, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what impact would the nuclear policy have on the New South Wales, Victorian and Queensland legislated emissions reduction targets? Does it make those targets unachievable?
Well, I can't speak for the states, and we haven't modelled that work. What we have modelled is the impacts on Australia's legislated targets, so the 43% emissions reduction target by 2030, and it shows that we will miss that target by 5% by 2030. And it will also see us not even hit the 43% emissions reduction target by 2035 under the nuclear scenario. So it will have implications, but I can't speak to the targets, the implications for the targets on the state-based scheme. So I don't know if Brad can illuminate, shed any light on that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you,
Chair.
Just one other question from me. The notion of holding on regarding the NDC till you see what the lie of the land looks like with so much fluidity in the world. Going to Senator Dunningham's questions, do you anticipate getting a better sense of the lie of the land in the shorter term? Like, I don't imagine you'd wait 4 years of their administration to determine what the NDC would be. So what's that sort of process of weighing up how things are going before you go, okay, we have a level of confidence about what the directions might be here, or at least a sufficient level of confidence to then be confident to set an NDC?
Well, this is a comprehensive body of work. There's a lot of conversations to be had. There's a lot of analytical work to be done. We are working closely with the CSIRO, with our modelling teams, but I mean, we're not going to rush this work. We need to make sure that we get it right because it has huge implications. And we want to make sure that when we put forward the recommendations, we're meeting our commitments under law, but we're also setting our economy up for a stronger and more prosperous future. That's what I'm focused on. And so we'll do the work necessary to ensure that when I stand up and we give the recommendation to the government, it meets those objectives. It's in our national interest. That's what I'm focused on, and we'll get the body of work done to ensure that that's the case.
Thank you. Senator Cadell?
Thank you. You're looking at the analysis. Going to New South Wales, where Eraring has been extended in life as a coal-fired power station, under the current ISPN plan, working there, is there no likelihood or possibility, you see no likelihood that coal stations would have to be extended at the current rate of build?
With regard to, can you just repeat that question?
Under the current plan, under the current ISP,
yes.
You see no likelihood or possibility that other coal stations will have to be included as we're going along as business as usual?
Well, I think it's important to remember that just because you extend these coal-fired power stations doesn't make them more reliable. I mean, I've been the Energy Minister. I know, I'm getting to your question. I've been the Energy Minister in New South Wales. I've seen the engineering reports around the ability to extend the life of these coal-fired power stations. I mean, you talk about the Eraring coal-fired power station. There's actually a physical constraint in extending that any longer than its scheduled timeline, and that's the ash dam that's associated with it. The ash dam has a finite life, and it would cost billions and billions and billions of dollars to extend that ash dam.
That's not the case anymore. I was at Eraring probably about 2 months ago. They're now pulling it on the books as an asset because they've found a buyer for the stuff and they've rebuilt the whole ash dam. They've worked on it. It's actually no longer got that constraint.
Well, with regard to my time as the Energy Minister,
I understand.
there was a physical constraint
changed
in place around the ash dam.
They closed my Una Bay because it wasn't up to standard. They've rebuilt it. It's now no longer has that concern.
But there is a physical or a rate limiter in a lot of these assets, whether it be the ash dam or the ability of that kit to be able to continue to work when you need it. That's not like an ideological thing, that's just an engineering reality. These things were built in the 70s and 80s, they're coming to end of life and they need huge capital upgrades to be able to operate. Could some of them be extended? Potentially, absolutely. But then you've got to also consider the economic realities of running these things, and they're losing cash
that's not my
during
point.
times of the
None
day.
of this is my point. I accept the economic realities. I accept the limitations.
Yeah.
Your costing on the extra emissions under a nuclear plan sees that any extension of coal has extra emissions going out. Are you saying there is no risk of that, no possibility of that under the government's plan?
No, what I'm saying is that under the assumptions that we've put in our model are the ones used by Frontier Economics. That's what we've based it on.
Okay, but some of those, given that when you were Energy Minister we weren't extending anything and now we're extending a RARing, or the state is, they've stepped in since the other government has changed.
When I was Energy Minister,
yeah, you did
we
not
weren't
do
in
that.
control of the assets, but yes.
But there is no guarantee that coal won't have to be extended anyway, even under the plan we're currently on, is there?
Can you repeat your question?
Under the plan that the government is on its scenario,
yes,
there is no guarantee that coal plants won't have to be extended anyway.
We can only model the scenarios in front of us.
But you can't give a guarantee, can you?
Are the Frontier Economics scenario.
You cannot give a guarantee
that
no coal goes longer.
Scenario.
Just say yes or no.
Cadell, there's a bit of a sort of blizzard of different contentions here.
Yep.
Just so that we can sort this a little bit. I mean, first of all, you said you accept the economic realities. Well, it's about time.
It costs money to keep coal open.
It costs a very significant amount of money. Your plan, Mr Dutton and Mr O'Brien and Mr Taylor's plan, requires these coal assets to continue to be extended in full, the 2 billion tonnes of additional emissions, but all of the additional cost into the system, making our industry less competitive. You say that the government's plan that we were elected to deliver, that there is evidence of at least one jurisdiction extending the life of a coal. I mean, that is from the government's perspective, we want to see as little of that as possible because it puts additional cost into the system. That is why we are so focused on delivering an outcome that has renewables plus storage plus gas to deliver the lowest cost, most reliable system possible. Does that mean that there might be some incremental? I mean, these are decisions that states will have to make, but it's not our intention. Your plan requires all of the coal assets to continue. I think Mr Littleproud said to sweat the assets, which is something you could only say if you'd never been in one. There has not been a single day over the last, couple of years where one of these assets hasn't had an unplanned outage, which puts additional cost in there for households, which puts additional cost in there for business, making business less competitive. We are focused on building an electricity system that is an electricity system for the future. I think comparing the assumptions that sit underneath the plan that the government is working with the states and the private sector to deliver with your $600 billion nuclear plan is comparing sort of apples with antelopes.
Well, Mr Ayres, you've decided to get involved in this conversation, so let's go there. Your plan said it was going to be $275 cheaper for householders. Today we've had evidence that it's $650 more expensive for householders on average since you came in. Your plan said we're going to get to 82, and we're hearing evidence that we struggled to get to 82 in that time frame. So if you can give me a guarantee that not a single coal asset will be extended beyond their current rate of day, there's nothing to talk about. Give me that guarantee and we'll move on. Can you give me a guarantee that no coal asset will be extended on its closed date as it stands? We've got our plan. They're down.
It is time that the Liberals and Nationals acted like adults in this debate.
We put on paper
act like adults. And there is no. We have seen. If the policy that you develop is the kind of policy that you have developed, you are going to be subjected to some scrutiny. And I know you don't like it. But there is going to be some scrutiny.
I accept the scrutiny. We put the policy on.
No, you've tried to silence it over the course of this. Your finance spokesperson says she's going to sack the people
Sorry
she
for talking while you were interrupting.
Honestly.
I really apologise again, Chair. I'm sorry for continuing with my question. Yeah, okay. But here is the point. You say it yourself, the frontier economics are on black and white. We admit that coal is going to have to stay longer. I accept that, right? Minister Ayres, this is your chance. Are you saying coal gets shut down on the times as they stand? You be black and white. You be open. But this is your chance to put it in.
That coal won't come out sooner than you anticipated.
Hang on, your modelling is against that.
You don't get to ask questions of opposition senators.
I'm sorry. I thought we were engaging in a robust debate, Senator. I thought we were having a conversation.
Here's your chance for your plan.
You know, we are a pragmatic, common sense government engaging the cheapest possible technologies in a systematic way to deliver a low-cost, reliable electricity system.
For those reading home, not a guarantee.
The sort of rule in, rule out nonsense is juvenile.
Okay. Well, it's simple. We're being honest. You can't give an answer. I'm not saying you're big distance.
There is like today, Chair. Just today. What are we? The 24th of February. There is 1.5 gigawatts of unplanned coal outages now.
Yep.
Making electricity more expensive because of your failure over a decade to do the work that was required to invest in the new energy system. Your failure has delivered that outcome, and having you in here claim that there's some, talking about transparency, and actually, it is about time you put your shoulder behind the wheel and actually contributed to the national effort here.
Well,
because 10 years of policy failure has made it tougher for ordinary Australians, and at least what you can say about this government is that we're pushing in the right direction, delivering the lowest cost technology in a planned and systematic and common sense way, and it's about time the Liberals and Nationals started acting in the national interest.
If I wanted your talking points, I'd read them when they get emailed to me at 8 o'clock. I don't need to listen to them anymore. I'll listen to more questions. Happy to rotate if someone else has got questions.
Do you have further questions?
Is anyone else from our side? I'll go. Just a follow-up.
Sure.
I don't know that I trust Mr Ayres enough to say that that interview happened. I'm not going to say that it's wrong.
Yeah.
If, from an emissions point, we are talking about $2 billion more under this plan and nuclear isn't your thing, would you be comfortable working for a government that has nuclear as a thing if it wins, or would you think that potentially you wouldn't want to be there?
Well, I'm surprised at the arrogance of people measuring up the curtains in the lodge at the moment, counting their chickens. I think
one
the
is.
Australian
I'm saying
people
if that was true,
would be very concerned.
I do not think that an official, even if the tone is pushing them around, can answer a hypothetical question.
I don't think that's a fair question. Okay. Senator Cadell?
Look, can I maybe respond and say that my position... As for my position, I'll continue to serve the best interests of the people of Australia and advocate for targets that protect the environment and grow our economy. That's not going to change regardless who's in government. These are positions that I've consistently taken in a coalition government, whereas the deputy leader of that government, that coalition government in New South Wales, which not only had the most rational economic policies, it also had some of the leading environmental policies supported in by the National Party.
Deputy leader of the Liberals, not the government.
That's right. That's right. Correct the record.
Thank you.
All done?
Yep.
Okay. Mr Keane, Mr Archer.
Thank you, Chair.
Ms
Thank
Murray,
you, Senators.
thank you so much for your time. We appreciate you coming to play with us today. And we wish you well in setting and undertaking and finalising the work around the NDC.